The boardroom on the 38th floor of Lane Tech smelled like leather and fresh orchids, the kind of scent that existed only in rooms where decisions worth millions were made before lunch. 14 chairs surrounded the conference table, all occupied except the one at the head, where Victoria Lane stood with her hands flat against the polished oak, her expression carrying the particular stillness of a woman who had stopped sleeping 3 days ago and started counting enemies instead. Richard Ashford sat at the opposite end, silver hair swept back, the $85,000 watch on his wrist, catching light from the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city he believed belonged to people like him. He was smiling. He had been smiling all morning, the way a man smiles when he knows the vote count before the meeting begins. But the door opened. Marcus Hart stepped through it, wearing a vest that did not belong to him, and carrying a leather binder 3 inches thick that belonged to everyone. He was tall and dark-skinned and moved with the unhurried calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his chest for 6 years without ever being certain it would arrive. He crossed the room in 7 steps, set the binder on the table with a sound that landed heavier than its weight, and looked directly at Richard Ashford. Richard's smile collapsed by degrees, first the corners, then the eyes, then something behind the eyes that had been comfortable for a very long time, and suddenly was not. Marcus did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. His words arrived the way weather arrives, without apology and impossible to argue with. And the man they called the bookshop owner had spent 11 weeks compiling every document, every email, every coded refusal letter connected to 73 black-owned businesses systematically shut out of the publishing supply chain over 6 years. 73 families. And this binder was only the beginning. The room went silent. Victoria Lane looked at Marcus Hart, and Marcus Hart looked at the man who had tried to erase him, and somewhere between those two gazes, the architecture of a 30-year conspiracy began to crack. Black screen, white text, plain as a headstone, 9 weeks earlier. Saturday mornings in Marcus Hart's life followed a rhythm so precise it could have been set to a metronome. He woke at 6, made oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced banana, checked Emma's backpack for forgotten homework, locked the apartment above the bookstore with the key that still stuck in the deadbolt every third turn, and walked 3 blocks east to the coffee shop on Maple, where his daughter ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, and he ordered black coffee with 1 sugar, because it was cheaper than a latte and because it was the way Denise had always made it, back when Denise was alive to make anything at all. Cancer had taken her 3 years ago. Slowly, the way it takes everyone, cell by cell and day by day, until the woman lying in the hospital bed looked nothing like the woman who had danced barefoot in the bookstore after closing, spinning between the shelves with Emma on her hip and Coltrane playing from the speaker she had bought at a garage sale. Marcus had not changed a single thing in the store since. The creaky floorboard near the poetry section stayed creaky. The water stain on the ceiling above the register stayed brown. The photograph of Denise on the wall behind the counter stayed exactly where she had hung it, level with her eyes, so she could see the door and know when he was coming home. Emma was 7, gap-toothed and serious, with her mother's wide-set eyes and a habit of asking questions that split his chest open like a letter he was not ready to read. She still kept her mother's old scarf folded under her pillow. She still whispered to the ceiling before sleep, conversations with a woman who could no longer whisper back. And she was building a science fair project called How Stories Heal the Brain, which involved index cards and colored yarn, and a hypothesis that Marcus suspected was more accurate than most doctoral theses he had read at Howard University. His master's degree in literary analysis hung on the wall behind the counter, half hidden by a stack of unsorted paperbacks, and Marcus left it there because taking it down felt like defeat and putting it forward felt like begging. He had been an adjunct lecturer, 2 semesters from tenure track, when Denise was diagnosed and the math changed overnight. A professor's schedule meant conferences and office hours and 80-mile commutes. A bookstore meant being home when Emma needed him, and Emma needed him every hour of every day for a year after her mother died. The bills on the counter told a story he did not read aloud. Rent, $1,400. Power, $187. Emma's health insurance, $340. The checking account held $214, which was enough for groceries and not enough for the shipment of books that should have arrived Thursday and had not. He was marking up a customer's manuscript at the counter, pen moving in the margins with the structural precision of someone who understood narrative architecture the way engineers understood load-bearing walls, when Emma looked up from her spot on the faded rug and asked why he did not teach anymore. Marcus glanced at the photograph of Denise. Being close to his daughter mattered more than any lecture hall, and the words came out softer than he intended, carrying the weight of a choice he would make again every single time. That particular Saturday, the coffee shop was crowded and the floor was wet, and the morning was unremarkable until it was not. Victoria Lane had not slept in 32 hours. The projected quarterly loss had climbed to $12 million. Her chief financial officer's emails arrived every 40 minutes like artillery shells, each one worse than the last, and somewhere around email number 19, she had stopped tasting the coffee she kept drinking and started walking toward the Maple Street shop near her office because it was closer than the espresso bar in the lobby, and because her hands were shaking in a way she did not want her assistant to see. She walked through the door, reading her phone. She did not see the yellow wet floor sign. Her heel caught the freshly mopped tile at precisely the angle physics requires for total loss of control, and her body pitched forward with the graceless momentum of a woman whose center of gravity had abandoned her along with everything else. She landed in Marcus Hart's lap. Coffee erupted across her $2,400 blazer. Her phone skidded under a stranger's chair. For 3 full seconds, she could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything except register the face of the man beneath her, brown-skinned and tired-eyed, and looking at her with an expression that took her a dangerously long time to identify. It was concern, simple and unguarded and entirely without agenda. The kind of look she had not received from another human being in longer than her pride would allow her to calculate. Emma's laughter broke through like church bells. Her small hands covered her mouth, her eyes enormous with delight, and she announced that the lady had fallen exactly like a princess in a book, and the innocence of it hit Victoria somewhere beneath her ribs where she kept the things she never examined. Marcus reached for napkins. He apologized for something that was not his fault. His voice was calm and warm and carried the particular gravity of a man who had survived worse than spilled coffee and learned to hold steady through all of it. The barista arrived in under 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds faster than she had delivered Marcus's order. She looked at Marcus, dark-skinned in a faded shirt, then at Victoria, designer blazer and $15,000 watch, and asked if Victoria was all right, if this man had done something to her. The words were shaped like concern, but built from something older and uglier, and Marcus said nothing. Just continued offering napkins with hands that did not tremble, because he had learned long ago that some battles were not worth the breath, and some battles were worth documenting instead. Victoria caught it. The flicker of something wrong in the barista's assumption, the reflexive geometry of suspicion that bent toward the black man and away from the white woman without anyone consciously drawing the line. She did not yet have the vocabulary for what she had witnessed. That vocabulary would come later, in a binder 3 inches thick. They exchanged names. She learned he owned the bookstore down the block, that Emma was his daughter, that the softness in his face when he looked at the child was a kind of love Victoria had never once stood close enough to feel. She left quickly, muttering about meetings, blazer ruined, chest hollow in a way that had nothing to do with coffee. But walking to her car, she realized Marcus had said something in their brief exchange that she could not stop turning over. She had mentioned, almost absently, the narrative problem eating her bored alive, and he had responded without hesitation. Narrative restructuring was about framing, he said. If she was losing control of the story, she needed to control the premise before someone else rewrote it for her. Those were not the words of a man who simply sold books. Those were the words of someone who understood how language built and destroyed power. 3 days later, she found Hart's pages tucked between a flower shop and a dry cleaner on a street her driver had never taken. She told herself she wanted something to read. She did not believe herself. And she suspected Marcus would not believe her either. The bookstore was warm and cluttered and smelled like paper and coffee and something faintly sweet that she would later learn was the lemon polish Emma used on the shelves every Sunday morning because her mother had always done it and Emma refused to let the ritual die. Victoria stood in the doorway and for the first time in years felt the muscles in her shoulders release, as though her body recognized safety before her mind could argue against it. Marcus looked up from the counter and recognized her immediately. Before he could speak, Emma came running from the back, finger pointed, announcing the return of the princess who fell. Marcus tried to apologize for his daughter's directness, but something at the corner of his mouth betrayed him, and Victoria found herself smiling back at a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that honesty was supposed to be embarrassing. She browsed. She asked about authors she had never heard of. Marcus answered with the quiet enthusiasm of a man sharing something he loved without needing anything in return, and Victoria realized she could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to her that way. Then she saw it. Behind the counter, half hidden beside the hidden diploma, a box filled with letters, printouts, and newspaper clippings. She was not supposed to see it, but Victoria Lane had built a $340 million company on the ability to notice what others intended to keep invisible, and the documents in that box were not invisible enough. Marcus followed her gaze. His expression shifted, and the warmth pulling back to reveal something harder beneath. Not anger, but resolve. The expression of a man guarding something more important than himself. He told her quietly, as though testing whether the words could bear the weight of being spoken aloud. It was not just his bookstore. 73 black-owned bookstores in 14 states had been systematically overcharged by an average of 23%. Deprioritized in delivery schedules, and denied vendor applications without cause by the same distribution network for 6 years. He had been collecting evidence since Emma was a baby. Every letter, every email, every rejection stamped with language so carefully coded it would take a linguist to prove what it really meant. Victoria stared at the box. Her pulse moved into her temples. She asked the name of the distribution network, already knowing the answer would cost her something. Meridian Publishing Group. $47 million contract with Lane Tech. Signed by Richard Ashford personally. The floor of the bookstore did not move, but Victoria felt it tilt anyway. That evening, Marcus picked up Emma from school and found her standing by the fence instead of running to meet him. Her eyes were red. A boy named Tyler had told her that black people did not belong in bookstores because black people did not read, and the words had landed on a 7-year-old's chest with the force of a stone dropped from adult height. Marcus knelt on the sidewalk and held both her shoulders. His face was perfectly composed, but his right hand pressed against her sleeve hard enough to leave a crease, and on the only evidence of what was happening inside him. Her grandfather had opened that bookstore 34 years ago, he told her. Her mother had read to her every single night, and Emma herself was reading The Little Prince for the 12th time, so she could answer her own question about whether black people read. Emma nodded, but her lip trembled, and Marcus pulled her close and held her against his chest while the afternoon traffic moved around them like a river parting for a stone. He did not know that Tyler's father worked for Meridian Publishing Group. He did not know that Tyler's words were not a child's invention but an echo of a dinner table where black businesses were dismissed with the same coded language that filled the box behind his counter. And he did not yet know that the woman who had fallen into his lap 3 days ago sat at the top of a company that had just written a $47 million check to the machine that had been grinding his family down for 3 decades. But he would. Emma did not read for 2 days after the incident at school. It was the first time the book had left her hands since Denise died, and Marcus found The Little Prince face down on the bedroom floor with its spine bent at an angle that looked like surrender. The sight of it hurt worse than the tuition bill on the counter, worse than the overdue notice from the power company, because a 7-year-old who stops reading is a 7-year-old who has started believing that the world the books promised her is not a world she is allowed to live in. Marcus went to the school on Monday morning. The teacher, a young woman with kind eyes and no authority to change anything structural, confirmed that Tyler had repeated language heard at home. The school's anti-bullying policy covered direct slurs, but had no mechanism for the coded variety, the kind wrapped in enough plausible deniability to survive a parent-teacher conference without anyone important feeling uncomfortable. Marcus listened. He nodded. He went home and sat at the counter in the bookstore and wrote a 3-page letter to the school board citing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, referencing the Office for Civil Rights Standards for Hostile Environment Harassment, and explaining with the clinical precision of a man who had spent 6 years studying the anatomy of institutional language exactly how coded speech created measurable psychological harm in children who were old enough to feel the wound but too young to name the weapon. The letter was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was correct. The principal called the district's attorney within 48 hours. Within a week, the school issued a revised policy addressing implicit bias language in classroom interactions, the first such revision in 11 years. It was a small victory, the kind that changed one hallway in one building in one zip code, and Marcus pinned the response letter to the corkboard behind the register next to Emma's science fair timeline and a faded photograph of his father standing in front of Hart's pages on opening day, 1991. Emma returned to The Little Prince on the 3rd morning, and the sight of her cross-legged on the rug with the book open on her knees released something in Marcus's chest that he had been holding so tightly he had forgotten it was clenched. 14 miles west, on the 38th floor of Lane Tech's headquarters, Richard Ashford closed his office door and picked up a phone that was not his company-issued device. The man on the other end was David Pruitt, chief executive of Meridian Publishing Group, and the conversation lasted 11 minutes and produced 3 decisions that Richard believed would never see daylight. First, Hart's pages would be removed from Meridian's vendor network effective immediately, shipment mid-route to be rerouted, and billing to reflect a contract violation that had not actually occurred. Second, Pruitt would contact 3 independent distributors who supplied the Mid-Atlantic region and recommend against future partnership with Marcus Hart. Language carefully chosen, nothing actionable, just enough to close every door that mattered. Third, the $47 million contract between Meridian and Lane Tech would be fast-tracked for renewal before anyone on Victoria's team had time to conduct the supplier audit that Richard had blocked in committee for 2 consecutive quarters. The HR file on Richard's desk contained 14 internal complaints about discriminatory vendor selection practices spanning 4 years. Each had been investigated by the same compliance officer, a man named Gerald Foss, who reported directly to Richard and who had concluded in every case that the decisions reflected legitimate business criteria. Foss's reports used a phrase that appeared verbatim in 11 of the 14 conclusions: cultural and logistical alignment. It meant nothing. It meant everything. And it had been enough to bury each complaint beneath a layer of procedural language thick enough to suffocate any auditor who did not already know what to look for. A memo dated October 2019 sat inside the file's inner pocket, unsigned but printed on Richard's personal letterhead. It directed Meridian's vendor intake team to deprioritize applications originating from zip codes 20001 through 20020. Every one of those zip codes served a majority black population, but the memo did not mention race. It did not need to. Geography had been doing that work in America for longer than Richard Ashford had been alive, and he understood the efficiency of letting a map say what his mouth could not. Richard held 34% of Lane Tech's voting shares. Victoria held 31%. The remaining 35% was distributed among 6 board members, 4 of whom had dinner with Richard more often than they had meetings with Victoria. He did not need to fire her. He needed to make her understand that her position survived at his discretion, and that discretion had limits she was testing by spending her afternoons in a bookstore on the east side of the city. Victoria returned to Hart's pages the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, and the rhythm of her visits began to settle into Marcus's week like a second heartbeat he had not asked for and could not ignore. She read The Little Prince to Emma one afternoon, while Marcus reshelved the poetry section, and Emma leaned into Victoria's shoulder with the unconscious trust of a child who does not yet know that adults leave. When Marcus came around the corner and saw them, the girl curled against the woman like a comma completing a sentence. Something shifted behind his sternum that felt less like a door opening and more like a wall deciding on its own to fall. He did not name it. Naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. Victoria invited him to dinner at a restaurant where the menus listed ingredients in French, and the bill for 2 would have covered his rent. Marcus sat stiffly, ordered water, and answered questions about his work with the guarded brevity of a man who understood that he was being displayed in a setting designed to diminish him. Afterward, standing on the sidewalk in his best shirt, he told her plainly that he did not belong in rooms like that and had no interest in learning to pretend otherwise. There was a faux restaurant at the end of his block where the owner knew Emma by name, and no one had ever made him feel like a guest in his own life. 2 days later, Victoria appeared in jeans and a ponytail and ate 2 bowls of pho and laughed when Marcus told her she held her chopsticks like a woman negotiating a hostile merger. Grace watched from the flower shop window the next morning and delivered her verdict with the efficiency of a woman who had been married for 32 years. The girl had eaten street food without photographing it first, which meant she was either in love or had finally lost her mind, and either way, Marcus should hold on. The weeks compressed. Victoria set up her laptop in the bookstore corner where the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that turned the dust motes gold. Marcus saved books for her on a shelf behind the counter where only he could see them. Emma began leaving a space on the rug, and the unspoken invitation carried more weight than any contract Victoria had ever signed. One afternoon, while Marcus was wrestling with a collapsed bookshelf that had finally surrendered to decades of weight, Victoria rolled up her sleeves and knelt beside him, holding boards steady and passing tools before he asked for them. When the shelf was stable and his hand brushed hers reaching for a rag, neither of them pulled away, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full. The kind of quiet that exists between two people who have stopped pretending they are not already falling. Marcus made his decision on a Thursday night after Emma was asleep. He opened the laptop at the kitchen table, the same laptop he had used to grade student essays at Howard, and began converting 6 years of collected evidence into a legal architecture that could bear the weight of 73 families. The work was not new. The documents, the letters, the shipping records, the rejected applications had lived in the box behind his counter since Emma was an infant. What was new was the structure, and Marcus built a linguistic corpus analysis of 12,000 internal Meridian emails provided by former employees and allied vendors, mapping the frequency and context of phrases like cultural fit, reliability concerns, and neighborhood risk. The results were damning in the way that only numbers can be damning, because numbers do not flinch under cross-examination. 89% of vendor rejection emails sent to Black-owned businesses contained at least one of those phrases. 0% of rejections sent to white-owned businesses contained any of them. Marcus cited 42 U.S.C. Section 1981 for contractual discrimination and 15 U.S.C. Section 1 for antitrust collusion in pricing. And the document grew page by page into something that could not be dismissed as grievance because it was built entirely from the language of the institutions it indicted. Victoria was sitting across the store one evening, watching him work, when she said it quietly, more to herself than to him. He was not just selling books. Marcus did not look up. He had a master's degree in textual analysis, he told her. Language lied, but patterns did not. The retaliation arrived on a Wednesday, delivered not by hand, but by email, which is how power prefers to do its cruelest work. Meridian terminated Hart's pages from its vendor network, citing a contract violation that existed nowhere except in a file Richard Ashford had requested David Pruitt fabricate the previous Friday. Within 72 hours, the two independent distributors who had supplied Marcus for years sent identical form letters declining to continue their partnership, the language so similar it was obvious someone had written both. Marcus pulled up his revenue projections on the kitchen table after Emma was in bed. Without Meridian and the two independents, his monthly income dropped by roughly 40%. The rent was $1,400. Insurance was $340. Food, utilities, the slow leak in the bathroom ceiling he had been ignoring for 6 months. The numbers did not add up. They had barely added up before. He sat alone in the darkened bookstore at midnight, the photograph of Denise watching from the wall, and felt the old gravity pulling him toward a familiar shore. He had survived loss before by shutting every door and standing still in the dark, and part of him wanted to do it again, to stop fighting and simply endure, because endurance was the only strategy that had never betrayed him. The thought lasted until morning, when Emma came downstairs carrying her science fair poster and asked if their store was going to be okay. Marcus looked at his daughter, at the index cards and colored yarn, and the hypothesis that stories could heal the brain, and understood that endurance without action was just a slower way of losing. His father had endured for 34 years. His father had died without ever seeing the system held accountable. Endurance was not enough. He called Grace. Grace called 12 other shop owners in the neighborhood mutual aid network she had organized during the pandemic. Within 48 hours, they built an alternative distribution chain, just smaller and slower and dependent on personal trucks and borrowed shelf space, but sovereign in a way that Meridian could not touch. It would not replace the lost revenue, but it would keep the lights on long enough for Marcus to finish what he had started. Richard Ashford made his move at a Lane Tech leadership offsite the following week, a conference room in a hotel with views of the river and wine that cost more per glass than Marcus spent on groceries. He addressed Victoria in front of 9 senior executives, his tone carrying the particular warmth that powerful men deploy when they intend to wound without leaving visible marks. A company of Lane Tech's stature, he suggested, required leadership whose public associations reflected the organization's values. Certain relationships, however well-intentioned, created optics that investors and partners found distracting. He did not say Marcus's name. He did not say black. He did not need to. The room understood. The room had always understood. Victoria sat perfectly still. Richard held 34% of the voting shares. 4 board members owed their seats to his endorsement. The quarterly earnings call was in 9 days, and the restructured Meridian deal was the centerpiece of her presentation to analysts. If she spoke now, Richard would call a confidence vote before the week ended, and she would lose the company she had built from nothing in a rented apartment with a laptop and a belief that she was smart enough to outrun every disadvantage her childhood had dealt her. She said nothing. Her face remained composed. Her silence landed on the table like a document everyone could read. It's an across the city. Marcus would learn about it through a text from an ally who had been in the room, and he would set his phone down on the counter and look at the photograph of Denise and feel the particular ache of discovering that someone you trusted had chosen safety over you. He did not call Victoria to argue. He called twice over the following days, and when she did not answer, he understood the silence for what it was. Victoria had disappeared into the crisis Richard manufactured around her, working 20-hour days, sleeping on the office couch, fighting a board insurrection designed to punish her for the crime of being seen near a black man who owned a bookstore. She won. After 2 weeks of war, the deal was restructured, the board was placated. Hart and Victoria sat alone in her office at 3 a.m, looking at a city full of lights that belonged to no one, and felt the particular emptiness of a victory with no witness. Marcus finished the binder on a quiet evening, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table. 247 pages, 73 cases, 47 sworn statements, 12,000 emails analyzed, 6 years compressed into a document that weighed less than 3 pounds and carried the grief of 3 decades. Emma looked up from her math worksheet. She asked if he was scared, and he answered honestly, because lying to his daughter was a border he had never crossed and never would. She was quiet for a moment, then told him that her mama always said he was the bravest person in the whole world. The words were simple and delivered with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old who believed her mother was still right about everything, and Marcus kissed her forehead and held her close and did not trust himself to speak. After Emma fell asleep, Marcus sat at the laptop and opened a new email. The recipient was Victoria Lane. The message contained no apology, no accusation, no request for reconciliation. It contained a single line of text and an attachment. Meridian Publishing Group, $47 million partner of Lane Tech, had systematically discriminated against 73 black-owned businesses for 30 years, and the evidence was attached. What she chose to do with it was her decision. If he pressed send and closed the laptop and sat in the dark bookstore, listening to the building settle around him like an old man lowering himself into a chair, tomorrow, everything would change. Victoria opened the email at 2:47 in the morning, sitting on the couch in her office where she had slept for 14 of the last 16 nights. The attachment loaded slowly, page by page, and she read every one of them without moving, without drinking the cold coffee on her desk, without checking the phone that buzzed twice, and then gave up. Page 14 contained the zip code memo from October 2019, and she recognized the letterhead before she recognized the handwriting. Richard Ashford. Page 47 held an email from Richard to David Pruitt at Meridian, sent the same week Marcus's distribution had been cut, requesting the removal of Hart's pages with a single justification line: Victoria is too close. Page 89 began the historical section, and the name James Hart appeared for the first time, Marcus's father, who had opened a bookstore in 1991 and been overcharged by 27% for 22 years and never filed a single complaint. Because in the America where James Hart built his life, complaint was just another word for extinction. Victoria closed the laptop at 4:11 and sat in the dark for 19 minutes. She had spent her entire career believing that neutrality was a position, that silence in a room full of wrong was the same as not participating. The binder made that belief impossible to sustain. Like her company had written a $47 million check to a machine that had been grinding down 73 families for 30 years. And her signature was on the contract, and her silence in that conference room had been the newest brick in a wall that James Hart had died staring at. She picked up her phone and called Lane Tech's outside counsel. At 5 in the morning, she called the board secretary and convened an emergency session for 9 o'clock. At 6:15, she stood in her bathroom mirror and noticed that her hands had stopped shaking for the first time in 2 weeks. Which told her something about the difference between fighting for a company and fighting for a reason. The rain started falling at 7:30, a cold, deliberate downpour that turned the city into a gray canvas of reflected headlights. Victoria drove east, past the flower shop that was still closed, past the dry cleaner with its metal gate down, and parked in front of Hart's Pages, where the window light was already on because Marcus had never learned how to sleep past 5. He opened the door and found her on the sidewalk without an umbrella, hair flattened against her temples, coat darkened with water, looking smaller and sharper than the woman who had fallen into his life 9 weeks ago. She did not ask to come in. She did not apologize. She looked at him with the stripped-down clarity of a person who had finally stopped calculating cost and started calculating consequence, and told him that she had read every page, that she was convening the board in 2 hours, and that she would stand next to him when he presented the evidence. And not because he needed her there, but because being there was the first honest thing she would have done in a room full of people since she built the company. Marcus studied her face the way he studied language, looking for the gap between what was spoken and what was meant. He found none. He stepped aside and let her in, and made tea the way he always did. And they sat at the counter in the gray morning light, and did not speak about love or loss or the 2 weeks of silence that had separated them, because what was about to happen in that boardroom was larger than either of their hearts, and both of them knew it. At 9 o'clock, 14 board members took their seats. Richard Ashford arrived last, carrying a leather portfolio and the particular confidence of a man who believes the agenda belongs to him. So Victoria stood at the head of the table and announced that Lane Tech was terminating its $47 million contract with Meridian Publishing Group effective immediately. The room fractured. Richard rose from his chair, objection already forming, and Victoria's voice cut through it with an authority she had spent 2 weeks earning back from herself. She told him to sit down. She was not finished. The screen behind her illuminated. Slide by slide, document by document, the architecture of 30 years of systematic exclusion filled the room like smoke. Zip code memos, pricing differentials, delivery timelines that averaged 14 days for black vendors and 5 days for white ones. 14 buried HR complaints. Gerald Foss's identical conclusions. The language map, 89% versus 0. Cultural fit as a weapon dressed in a suit. Then the door opened and Marcus walked in carrying the binder that had taken 6 years to build and 4 weeks to organize into something no compliance officer could dismiss. He set it on the table and introduced himself with the composure of a man who had rehearsed nothing because the truth does not require rehearsal. His name was Marcus Hart. He held a master's degree in textual analysis from Howard University. He was the son of James Hart, who had opened Hart's pages in 1991 and been systematically overcharged for 22 years until the day he died. His father had written one line in a letter Marcus found after the funeral. "Someday, someone will be strong enough to speak." Marcus looked at Richard Ashford across 12 feet of polished oak. He was standing here because his father could not. He presented for 11 minutes. No raised voice. No accusation that exceeded the evidence. 73 names read aloud, each one a business, each business a family, each family a story that Meridian had tried to reduce to a line item on a rejection spreadsheet. When Richard attempted to interrupt, calling the pricing decisions standard business practice, Marcus responded without breaking rhythm. Cultural fit appeared in 89% of rejection emails sent to black-owned vendors and in 0% of those sent to white-owned vendors. That was not business practice. That was pattern. And patterns, unlike people, could not be taught to lie. Richard looked around the table for allies. The 4 board members who had dined with him monthly could not meet his eyes. And not the room had shifted, not because Marcus had been louder, but because he had been more precise. And precision in a room full of lawyers is the only currency that never devalues. Victoria called the vote. Richard Ashford resigned before the count was completed, walking out of the building with his leather portfolio and the silence of a man who understood that the architecture he had spent 6 years constructing had been disassembled in 11 minutes by someone he had never considered a threat. Lane Tech referred the full evidence package to the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Victoria announced the creation of a $4.2 million restitution fund for the 73 affected businesses, funded by the recovered Meridian contract budget. The story reached national media within 72 hours. Meridian's CEO was placed under federal investigation. 3 senior executives were suspended pending review. The hashtag 73 bookstores trended for 4 days, which in the economy of public attention was long enough to change the conversation and short enough to remind everyone that attention is not the same as justice. Justice took longer. It always does. 6 months later, Marcus sat before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, wearing the blue button-down shirt Emma had chosen for him and the vest he had borrowed for the boardroom, and delivered testimony on coded discrimination in American supply chains that would be cited in 3 subsequent federal rulings. He told the committee that 73 families had not asked for special treatment. They had asked for equal treatment. His father had waited 22 years for that hearing. His father had not lived to see it, but his daughter, Emma, 7 years old, would grow up in a country that was 1 degree closer to the place those 73 families had always believed it could be. The Department of Justice expanded the investigation across 14 states. The scope widened beyond publishing into musical instruments, educational equipment, and sporting goods. Total estimated damages reached $180 million. 34 bookstores that had been weeks from closing received restitution. 12 expanded. On a Saturday morning 1 year after the boardroom, Marcus closed the bookstore early and walked 3 blocks east to the coffee shop on Maple, where Emma ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream and Victoria ordered black coffee with 1 sugar, the way Denise had always made it, because some rituals are not replaced, but expanded to hold more people. Emma sat between them wearing a blue ribbon from the district science fair, her project on how stories heal the brain having received the highest score in the 7 to 9 age category. And she held her copy of The Little Prince in one hand and a basket of flower petals in the other, because later that afternoon there would be a small wedding in a bookstore. The ceremony was held between the shelves that Marcus and Victoria had repaired together. Grace arranged the flowers. 12 neighbors filled the folding chairs. Emma served as flower girl with the grave authority of a child entrusted with an important task. And on Victoria's finger was a silver band engraved with a single word: Hart. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home and the bookstore was quiet, the 3 of them sat on the old sofa beneath the photograph of Denise. Emma's head rested on Victoria's lap. Her feet were tucked against Marcus's side. The building settled around them the way old buildings do, with sighs and creaks that sound like breathing if you have lived in them long enough to listen. Victoria leaned close and whispered that she was grateful he had let her fall into his life. Marcus whispered back that he was grateful she had chosen to stand. Outside, the city carried on with its noise and its weather and its imperfect machinery of human beings trying to build systems worthy of the people inside them. But inside Hart's pages, surrounded by books that smelled like paper and lemon polish and 34 years of a family's refusal to disappear, there was only the sound of a 7-year-old breathing in her sleep, dreaming of stories that healed, and the quiet certainty that some things, once built from truth, do not fall down.